So one of the things that I recommend artists to have is a couple anatomy books. And this is a book I really like. It's very thorough. And this is The Human Body for Artists by Elliot Goldfinger. It's got every single thing that you need to know about anatomy for artists. And it starts with a skeleton, of course, and all the way to the myology of the human body, including individual insertions and origin points of muscles. I don't really recommend this book if you're a beginner because it's so in-depth. It doesn't give you the big picture that you need to learn anatomy. And this one is by Sarah Simlett, and it's Anatomy for the Artist. It's much simpler. It's got really great photos so you can look at the muscles in the human body. Art of anatomy rather than the science of anatomy. This book gives you just enough information about the human body and anatomy to give you an overview. And one of the really great things about it is that it's got these transparent pages that overlap onto the human body so you can see the skeleton and the bones. There's quite a few in there, but the photos are excellent. The models in this book are very fit, so you should be able to tell exactly what's happening in the muscles. And learning anatomy is something that's not very common in art schools these days because everybody wants to paint and they just look at the human form as as if they're just doing the surface. They don't understand what's underneath, and understanding what's underneath is extremely important, especially for sculpture. Even when you do comic book sort of sculpture, you should understand what is happening in the body. Even if you're doing like a monster, like some sort of creature, the underlying structure of even monsters resemble human anatomy. Even when you learn about creature anatomy, even like horses, animals, all the anatomy lends back into human anatomy. And the names that we give muscles in the human body are the same muscles that you find in horses, chickens, everything. They all have latissimus dorsi, gluteus, maximus, tensor fasciae latas. Everything is in animals. This one even gives you the veins that you would find in the human body. So here you have like the skeleton. And the reason I have this book out is that as I'm sculpting the human body here in this sculpture, I've run out of reference. The reference that I have doesn't give you the complete picture. So what you have to do is go to some anatomy studies and learn what is happening so you can model your sculpture a lot better. So one of the things I've done with the sculpture, just so I can sculpt the back a little bit easier, I'm eventually going to position it in a different angle as well, but it's difficult to get to the back here. So when I am looking at my model, what you have here is the deltoid, and the deltoid is pretty large, and it's almost like triangular shaped. It's like a diamond shape that starts at the acromion process and it develops throughout the upper part, the upper arm, all the way to the middle of the humerus. It comes down pretty far. And what we're looking here is the scapula. There's quite a bit of things happening. So the spine of the scapula runs this way, and this is the inferior angle of the scapula, and then the scapula actually goes forward. So if you were to have a plate, it would be facing this way and not on the outside. The scapula is not attached to any bones. It kind of moves freely in the back. That's why we have such a large range of motion. And another thing that's really important here is there's this muscle here. It's a little confusing, but it attaches to the bottom, the inferior part of the scapula, the medial part here of the scapula. So this would be the origin. And then it inserts into the bicipital groove. This muscle is the teres major. The bulge is the teres major. And then on the spine of the scapula underneath it's the infraspinatus, which is a very big muscle, but the teres major is actually on top of the infraspinatus. So that's the bulge that you see here. New images, and I did a quick search for some of these similar type of poses because I could probably see a little bit more. Now you're going to go from model to model, and they're not going to be as toned as the previous model, so that's the danger of going from model to model. And these are some details. This one's a little bit more of a toned model. Here's a pretty decent one from Dreamstime, which is a stock image sort of place. You can buy these photos. This is the model that I'm using. So you can see she's pretty fit. She's also a little bit more muscular. And, you know, I think she's a better model than the ones I have. And I also, if you can tell the difference between this and this, I use Photoshop to tone it up and bring up the contrast. This is another pose that is similar because I wanted to look at the back. As one of the things I have done here, I removed the head and I just made some details. It doesn't have to be perfect at all. So the thing that I want to do is just to make a subtle face. It doesn't have to be much of anything. I think I'm just going to make it a little bit prettier. And then I'm going to do the hair. She's going to have her hair in a ponytail, kind of bunched up like this. And you don't need to put a lot of detail because the head is going to be hidden. So normally, if the head is going to be hidden, there's not much point in spending a lot of time, but you should still indicate the head. So the next thing I'm going to do is just to add the bun, which is just the direction. And then I'll kind of stick it on. You need to indicate the sartorius. So when you look at the thigh, it's not just one cylinder that goes around the thigh. There's a lot of muscles in there. But generally when you are in this position, it's going to be a lot more cylindrical until you get to the bony landmark here, which is the patella and the kneecap, otherwise known as the kneecap. But also, there is a muscle that runs diagonally along the upper thigh called the sartorius. Remove the arms just so I can sculpt the knees. So it's fairly easy to remove. You can use a knife like this just to remove the arms. I could also just remove the arms this way. And this clay is extremely easy to remove. So I just made a cut there. I'm going to make a cut here. And now that I have my general proportions, it's easy to remove things. So what I'm going to be doing now is make a cut here, I think. Yeah, I think I'll make a cut here. And even though I might butcher a little bit of the sculpture on doing this, it'll fit in perfectly once we put it all together. And this is a good way too. If you made your figure a little bit too large, you can always remove an extra vertebrae and make it shorter or make it longer. There we go, it is moving. You have to be careful. You don't want to be damaging a lot of the anatomy. So let's look at the chest. Now that I've removed it, you can see it's not exactly a perfect sculpture. This muscle goes all the way to the deltoid. And this arm is actually, should be coming up a little bit. doing is trying to correct all the things that I've done. So as you recall, I made a cut here in the torso. I cut the arms, I pulled everything out, I stitched the face back up, and now I have a little bit better sculpture, especially in the interior portion of the sculpture here. So with this, I have her face done, I have her thighs done, enough that I don't need to concentrate too much anymore on the interior part, since I'm not going to be showing it too much. So at this point, I have to add the anatomy to the back. Right now it rises up too much, so I'm going to cut a little bit alongside here. It might look okay, but these two parts are not the same. Even though the pose reference that I have, she is leaning to one right, she has her weight on one foot rather than the other, but I wanted to make it a little bit more symmetrical. So I have the posterior iliac spine right here. That's what these marks are going to be. Then you have the sacral triangle. The sacral triangle basically just means that the sacrum is here. Then the bone that actually kind of goes down this way is the coccyx, which is the tailbone or the hip bone. In conclusion, I did sculpt the head. I removed the head and I removed the torso, and I sculpted the middle, a little bit of the chest area, and that also let me get into the thighs. That way I could sculpt the knees and everything. I do like sculpting knees, but this is a pose that doesn't really let you get into some of the finer details of the chest, and I am struggling finding enough reference so I can really get some detail, but this is the general idea of the sculpture. And I have been modifying things here and there, like the asymmetrical composition of the piece is a little bit off. I keep going back and modifying the back because I'm not really happy with it. And you just have to make very small changes here and there. Like the arms look a little bit too big for me, but I did measure them and they look to be about right. The way to measure, especially for sculpture, is that if you have a caliper, and I have a caliper here, I can take a measurement, especially at this size, say from the elbow to the acromion process, and then I can reference, say, from here to here and figure out exactly where things are. So tomorrow, that's probably what I'll be doing. I'll be taking more measurements, especially in the waist to hips sort of measurements, taking the waist to arm measurements. So this is a very good tool to have, and I have a stick here. It's one of those shish kebab sticks where I can make measurements, and I can just basically do this. That will create a measure, and it'll be there. Then I can take a measurement from my 7th cervical vertebrae to here, for example. And the great thing about this sort of stuff is that you can even write on the clay like 7, so you know it's like a 7 cervical vertebrae. So with this, I am going on my way. I started adding a little bit of the hair and starting to sculpt the hair. So now in the future, the thing I'm going to be doing is more details. I'm going to be narrowing it down into little sections and finessing things. I think her hips are still a little bit too big from a few vantage points. And in sculpture, you really have to look around quite often. And it also helps to completely put your model in a strong light. That way you can see where the shadows would hit. But this is the third session, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.